All right, this is going to be an analysis of a chorale melody that was pre-existing before Bach. Bach did not compose this melody, but he reharmonized it. And that's what's going to be interesting about how we're going to analyze it, because the original chorale would not have had as many interesting chords that Bach puts in here, and some of the modulation as well. I picked a very short piece so that it would be easiest to see how the analysis process is done. Ach Gott, Gott und Herr literally translates my Lord and God. That would be the translation of it in English. Not transliterally, because Gott does mean God, but it does, when used in English, it's my Lord and God. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the piece first for you so that you can hear what it sounds like. This is using finale sounds. Those fermatas would be there because that's where the verse and the end of the sentences lie. So there's natural places where you're supposed to pause. Now, at any rate, you could hear that there was several different kinds of chords going on there, and I hope that you clearly heard that there was a modulation taking place. We're in the key of C major, as you can see in the key signature, and then you do see the presence of a lot of accidentals. And that usually is a signal that there's some type of modulation, or that there's some secondary dominance and secondary leading tone chords being used, which Bach would have been very fond of. To determine if it's going to be a modulation or not is that you need to have a longer portion of the music staying in a particular key that keeps the accidental going. And I can see right now, looks like we're moving to G major because I see a lot of F sharps there, just to kind of let you know. At any rate, you could listen to a piece of music like this if your ear was capable of listening. You can hear all the different chords. At any rate, the first thing to do is to analyze the actual chords and make sure that you understand what chords are going on. That's why the popular chord analysis is the best. Benward calls them macro analysis symbols. That gets you thinking about what possible keys that you might be in. So again, we're in the key of C major. But first, go ahead and analyze each chord. And what I'm going to do is I think you can see my little cursor here. Of course, my first chord is a C major, and I'm going to use this tool here to go ahead and actually create the chord. And so I'm going to call the first chord C major. Second chord looks clearly like a G major, everybody. Next chord, interestingly enough, has that F sharp in it. And if you'll notice in the tenor, the D and then going to a C, looks like a passing tone going down, but to me I hear that as a D7, or I see it as a D dominant 7. And that C natural to me is a chord tone, and I can see it functioning just like we talked about in class, where the 7th does resolve down in a circle progression. D7 going to the G chord. And there it is. There's the G right there. So I'm going to put the G. Next, this is interesting. You see that B flat in there? Now it's like, are we going to the key of F? It's a possibility, but it doesn't sound like it doesn't look like he's doing that for very long. I don't see that B flat there for very long. Especially in the third measure, you can see there's a B natural in the soprano. But still, it's curious that that chord is there. It is being harmonized with a D on the top, so that makes it a little bit more interesting that is it a C dominant 7? Adding that D, making it almost sound like a 9. A jazz musician might consider that, but I still like the idea of it being a C dominant 7, especially since I see the tenor, B flat, resolving down to the third of the next chord, the F major. Another circle progression, C7 to F major. So I am going to call it C dominant 7. I'm just going to go ahead and analyze that chord that way. That's the way I see all those chords. Next, definitely an F major chord here. Some passing tones, both E and G, going down to the next chord, which looks like we've got an inversion here. So far we've been all root position chords, but this chord here, spelled out D, F natural, D, B from the bass up, could not be a D minor chord because we have a B natural in it. So that's a B diminished chord. And that is an inversion. So I have to change how I use finale here. That's a B diminished. And I'm going to call it B diminished, right? And sometimes it doesn't let me do the symbol. I'm going to try it and see if it will do it. And that's going to be a slash with a D in the bass. As you can see there, that's an inversion of the chord. The next chord goes right to C, so it's probably a 7 of that chord. Next we're back to good old G major. And then, here's an interesting chord here. If you read all the notes, you actually would be tempted to call that A minor 7, and it could be on A minor 7 because we have that G in the chord. So, but another chord that you might call it is sort of like a D7 too. It's an interesting mix of what you would call that. I'm going to go ahead and call it an A minor, and we'll just leave it at A minor. Could call it A minor 7, but again, I'm just going to leave it as A minor. Let's put the 7 in. All right, next, a G major chord, inverse inversion though. As you can see there, the B is going here. Next chord, this is a D major, everybody, because the F sharp is remaining in the alto part. That's a D major. Root position. Here's a G chord. And then we go down below here. Here's another interesting little spot here. What to call the chord? Because you see that A in there, and that lasts for quite a while. It's going for a half note in the soprano voice. So if you wanted to be completely accurate, you could call that an A minor 7 because I have all the notes there, A, C, E, and G. So I'm going to call that an A minor 7 in inversion here with a C in the bass. Then the next chord, because that A is going through, we have a D, D, F sharp, and A. That's a D major chord. I do see that C natural. I like the idea of that being a dominant 7 chord, especially since it's going D to G major. I have a descending 5th pattern. Bach, like we could predict, is resolving the 7th down. So I'm going to call that a D7. Oh, the chord didn't fit really well there. And then, okay, and then the next chord is G major. Next chord, that's a C major, but see what's in the bass. So it's an inversion, C with E in the bass, first inversion of that C chord. Next chord, he's doing this again with these inversions. This is a B diminished because there's no way to kind of call this chord a D minor because there's no A in it. As a B, D, and then F. So it's a B diminished. Oops, sorry, I'm shaking the video. And with a D in the bass. Next chord, C, whoops, it wouldn't let me do that. Did you see that? All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and call it a B diminished, which it doesn't like, slash D. There we go. Now we're going to go to G major again. Here's a G chord. Continues to be a G chord here. And then this chord here is a C major chord. Next chord, D. There's that 7, only this time it's a neighbor tone. Yeah, I think so. I'm going to call that a D7. I like the idea of that being a D7. In an inversion, though, we have an A in the bass. This time it's the 5th in the bass. So if you know your numbering, that would be, once I put the Roman numerals down, it would be a second inversion of that D7 chord. D7 with an A in the bass. And then resolves where I expect, G major. And then the next chord, looks like oh, my soprano, where did my soprano go? Oh, it's a unison to a G, pardon me. So that's a C chord with an E in the bass, first inversion. Next chord, as you can see, he's got some inversions going here. This is a D7 chord in an inversion with the F sharp in the bass, the 3rd. So that's a D7 in first inversion, F sharp. Next chord, nice. He's got here's the G sharp, a B, and a D. So that would spell a G sharp diminished chord. It's like, what's that doing there? It's probably a secondary leading tone is my guess. G sharp diminished. Sometimes it's hard to get these chords in. And I'm going to redo those chords in hand so that you'll see them clearly when I do the Roman numeral analysis. Next chord, well, it goes where I expect. The G sharp diminished resolves to A minor. And note this C in the tenor. That's going all the way across here, even on this 4th beat, because that actually is a dotted C. You can't see it in the text. That's a dotted C. Then there's this 8th note here. So this chord here with a G, another G, but the C going through and an E makes it a C chord in second inversion because there's a G in the bass. That doesn't surprise me with sort of a cadential kind of ending here that would also be just like Bach to give us that second inversion of the 1 chord. Here's an F major chord right there on the and of 4. And then to this chord here. Oh, that's nice. And I could hear it too when I was listening to it. That is a G chord, but there's a suspension here. See that C? How could you call that a G chord? Or why am I calling it a G chord? And instead of calling it a C chord, well, that D is very problematic. It's not going to be a C chord with a 2nd in there or a 9. But you can see that this chord here, G, continues on over here. There's an F natural. That starts to make it sound like G7. So the C, which hangs on from the previous tenor, is really an accented suspension. 4-3 suspension tenor. C going to B, the 3rd of the G chord. So I'm going to call that a G7. And then when I do my analysis, I will write that this is a 4-3 suspension right here. Here's the 7th of the chord. The D goes across. Both roots, G and G. I'm calling it G7 at this point because I know it's going to carry across. And of course, that 7th resolves down to the 3rd of C major. And that's the key of the piece. So what I'm going to do next is analyze the entire composition for you in Roman numerals so that you can see the process by which I figure out how to do the modulations and any of the secondary dominants and secondary leading tones that may occur here. But what an interesting and great piece of music. So over and out. I'll lead this into another part of the of this video, going into a handwritten analysis. I did want to play the piece over for you again. This is an interesting way that finale works. You can see that I've already put those chords in, and excuse me, because those chords are kind of, you can see them kind of clashing just a little bit. But at any rate, I'm going to play it, and it actually does this. The finale will play the chords in addition to the notated music. So every once in a while you'll hear like a root note that when in our inversions sometimes aren't going to go through, just because finale chooses a different way of doing it, meaning that the inversion, sometimes you'll hear the note an octave lower than what's written. At any rate, because we've analyzed it correctly with the inversions, it will still sound like the actual chorale that was written by Bach. So I'm going to play the whole thing over again with the notation playing, and finale is playing the chords as well. So let's listen to it again. Nice. Okay, I'm going to do an analysis. I'm going to use do it by hand because it's easier to show everybody the process that I'm using to change keys. Now, one thing I want you to kind of look at, and that is the fermatas. Fermatas are ending points in the verse, and where the lyrics would stop, and that's important to Bach in terms of where he wants to center the sound. So we always have to consider that as a way of figuring out maybe what particular keys that he's trying to present. The other thing, and the most important part, is to check all accidentals. So notice we got F sharp here, B flat here, F sharp, F sharp, F sharp over here, F sharp here, G sharp, returning to naturals over here. So accidentals always represent for us visually some type of key change or alteration of the key. So now I'm going to look at this and say, you know, I really don't think that we're going to the key of G here, primarily because by the time he gets back here, he's in the key of C. As you can see here, there is a D7, so it's like, what's that D7 doing in the key of C? But I have to tell you that I think these are little transitions that Bach is trying to kind of make spice up the key a little bit, which he does. So I'm going to call them secondary dominants, and I'm going to say that this whole spot here, this whole area going to this cadence, going to here, is actually all C major. So in order for me to do that, I have to be able to represent what this D7 is and this C7, both out of the key of C major. I'm going to call them secondary dominants. And as you know, a secondary dominant has to be indicated in Roman numerals with a slash, a 5-7 pointing to what chord in the key we're going to call it. So I'm going to go C major. Sorry about the handwriting. It's a little hard to write it at the angle I'm writing it at. 1 in root position to a 5 in root position. And I'm going to call this D7 5-7 of 5 because it's the 5-7 dominant 7 chord of the G chord, which is the 5 chord in C. And then my cadence is a half cadence to G major. I've got a C7. I'm calling it C7 because of this, and I'm saying that because there it is going to F. What is the F chord in C? It's the 4 chord. So I'm going to say this is a 5-7 of 4. And there is my 4 chord right there. Then I have a B diminished, another reason that I'm not in the key of G here. B diminished is the 7 chord of C, but we do have an inversion. And it's in first inversion, so that's going to be a 6 going to 1. So I'm saying there's no key change yet. And then all of a sudden, I do see that there's F sharps here, and they remain all throughout. Here's an F sharp. That remains as an F sharp. Here's an F sharp here. And notice the absence of one over here, though. So I feel going from here to here is really a point in which Bach is making a modulation into the key of G major, closely related key. So I have to determine when that happens and if it's going to be chromatic or common chord modulation. And obviously there's a lot of common chords between the key of C and G major, G being one of them. And so I look to see when that F sharp occurs, and it occurs right here. I think that's the point at which we're departing into the key of G major. I could have waited and said that, really it's right here, this D major chord, which is clearly not in the key of C major, but I think that he's making his move right here. So I have to find the closest chord that gets me to that D major chord right over here with that F sharp. If I did that, I could either say, well, it's A minor is common chord, but then again, so is G major. So I'm going to use the G major right here as the common chord going to D major, which I think is the actual real key change. I think this is a little bit of spice here. We can call that a neighbor tone, the F sharp. So I'm going to say we continue on the key of C. This is a 5. An A minor 7 would be a 6 chord in the key of C major. So I'm saying C major still. Then I got a B chord or G chord with a B in the bass. That's a 5 chord in first inversion. And then all of a sudden I got a D. And I can't call something like that in C major unless I said secondary dominant. I don't think it's a secondary dominant. I think it's a key change. So I'm going to say that the common chord between G major and C major is the G chord. And so that's going to be a 1-6 in G. And then all of a sudden I'm in the key of G, and I'm going to clearly put 5 chord for the D major. I'm no longer in the key of C. I'm going to start analyzing in the key of G. And if I'm correct, all this should fit. Here's another 1 chord, G major. An A minor 7, which I can still call in this key because that's a 2-7. It is an inversion. So 2-7 chord in first inversion is a 6-5. And then there's my D7. I'm going to call that 5-7 going to 1. Sure makes sense that we would cadence in the key of G with a 2-5-7-1. Classic. That's Herr Bach for you there. Now, we're also going to G here. But this is interesting because, you might say, well, aren't we still in the key of G? Well, I do have an F natural there. That's a little bit, and that's kind of interesting. I could call that a diminished 7 going to a C chord of a 4 chord, but it's very unusual for me to have a 4 to a 5, kind of a half, if I'm in G major rather, a plagal cadence, kind of a C going to a G chord. I don't think it's a plagal cadence. I think we're temporarily coming back to the key of C major. So in order for me to show that, I would then have to say that this is where I think the key change occurs, on the B diminished because of the F natural. and that not being in the key of G, because the G chord, in the key of G, B would be B minor, not B diminished. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to show that I've returned back to C major. And I'm going to do it via this common chord here. So I'm going to say, in the key of G, C chord is a 4 chord, and it is a first inversion, so it's a 6. But in the key of C, it's a 1 chord. 1, 6. B diminished is the 7 in first inversion with a 6. Oh, look at that. I don't have a C chord here. And the next chord is a C. That's a 1. And then I'm going to say 5. I believe that sounds like a half cadence. It really does. It doesn't make sense that it would sound like 1, especially with these chords. Now, as I'm moving along, I'm seeing those F sharps again. And I think that this cadence here, when listening to it, really sounds like it's home. Sounds like a 1. So what I'm searching for are 5 to 1 relationships, or 1 to 5s. As you can see here, this is a half cadence to me, not a 4 to a 1. So I'm going to go back to the key of G. And to do that, I need to find what's common between those two keys before a modulation chord takes place. And that modulation chord to me is the D7. There's an F sharp right there. So I look before it, and I find the C chord. C chord is common to both keys. So I'm going to say G is still a 5 chord at this point. And then it's a 4 chord here in the key of G, because remember now I'm analyzing in the key of G. But I'm going to say we're also, as a pivot chord, back to 1 with C major. Pardon me, I messed that up. I'm going to be in the key of C still as a 1 chord, and then I'm going to the key of G. I knew I was doing something wrong there. Which is a 4 chord. Then I go to a 5, because that's the D7. And look at the inversion. It's a D7 with an A in the bass. So that's second inversion. That's 4, 3, and then going to 1 in G major. I think that's a move to the key of G major temporarily. You could call that a secondary dominant going to a 5 chord, but I believe that it's still centering on G. It seems like that's home. Now, we have a very interesting section here where we're clearly kind of going to an A minor chord. This is a really beautiful little section here where Bach kind of emphasizes the A minor. So my decision has to be, is this A minor in the key of G, is that a 2 chord? Is it an A minor in the key of C, a 6 chord? Because we're clearly coming back to the key of C. But with Bach, you have to listen to see, does it sound like he's really headed to a certain place? Does A minor really sound like it kind of feels like home? And when listening to it again, it sort of does. And so I'm going to analyze this by saying that we're going to go into the key of A minor. Invariably in the Baroque and classical period, we're going to use harmonic minor. That's why there's a G sharp diminished here, the raised 7 of A minor. But then that makes it very curious that we have a D7 here, the F sharp. But if I use melodic minor, F sharp, G sharp, and that's what's going on here, a raised melodic minor scale, that's what's giving me a lot of evidence that the A minor is the point at which he wants to go to, that he's really trying to create that effect. So I'm going to say that I'm going to A minor because of this, and especially because of this melodic minor scale. So I have to show what kind of modulation is taking place. And I can do a common chord modulation from A minor and G. I can use the C chord. And so I'm going to use this C major right here. In fact, I can still say that it's D7. That's right. What am I saying? This G sharp diminished is the one that's out of character. D7 is still a 5 chord in the key of G. So I'm going to say C chord is 4, in first inversion. D7 is 5 in first inversion as well. D7, 6, 5. Then I'm going to say in the key of A minor, as a pivot chord, D7 could also be the 4 chord in melodic minor, which would create a D7 chord because F sharp is in there, C natural is in the key, D of course is in the key, and A is in the key. So I'm saying that the pivot chord is the D7. And I'm showing it that way. 5 in the key of G, 4 in the key of A minor. Because this is what's going on here. That's a 7 chord, G sharp diminished. Only as a triad. A minor, I'm saying, is 1. Then when I see this melodic minor coming back down, it's like, okay, I see this here. There would be a C chord in the key of A minor. There would be an F chord. And I feel like at that point, that's the pivot, because in the key of A minor, there is no G7. Right here, there's that F going across. I'm going back to the key of C. So I'm going to use as a common chord F. And G7 is then going to be my return to the keys. So I analyze A minor as 1. The C chord in second inversion as a 3 chord. And that'll be 6, 4. The F as a 6 chord, which it is. 6 chord Roman numeral. Make sure that I do the Roman numeral correctly. 4. And I'm using that F chord as a common chord, a pivot chord, saying it's the 4 chord in the key of C, and there I did it again. In A minor, it's the 6 chord. So the 6 chord of A minor is F. The 4 chord of C is also F. I'm showing common chord. Then I'm saying the G7 is 5, 7 to 1. I'm calling it a G7 because of this. And this, interestingly enough, is a 4, 3 suspension in the tenor. A classic suspension like that with a cadence like that. 4, 3, 4 because it's the 4th holding over from the tenor. That's why it acts as a suspension. Going to the 3rd of the chord, there's a 7, and then going right to C. So, because I didn't want to do any editing, you did see me kind of go through the process of making a few little errors with my Roman numerals, but at any rate, caught that one and caught those. So I'm saying C major all the way across, modulating to G major. Common chord is the G chord in first inversion. Modulating back to C major briefly, common chord C major. Going then to the key of G major again, common chord C major. Going to the key of A minor, using melodic minor, that's where the F sharp comes from. Common chord is the D7. And then modulating back to C major, common chord F major, to get back to the key of C. So all common chord modulations, not one chromatic modulation took place. And again, what a nice piece of music, and very short, of course, but quite extensive, having to analyze the harmonic progression. Also note that all the keys that Bach went to were closely related keys: C, G, A minor, back to C. And that's it. I wanted to attach at the end of this video the piece being played or sung by a choir, and this is a version of it. Interestingly enough, everything is down a half step. They're actually starting on C flat. The whole thing is down a half step if you're listening to it from the original that we had in C major. At any rate, I am attaching it, and so it would be interesting for you to hear this, as a choir, would perform it